Good evening, my name's Jim Waterston and I'm the Dean of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education and very privileged and proud to be here tonight representing that organisation. Can I welcome you all to our final Dean's Lecture for 2018, and let me say that it's been a spectacular series, but tonight's audience has got that feel of being at a concert, so I feel like we've saved the best till last, which is fantastic. So welcome to everyone here. This is, I was just talking to Field Rickard, the former Dean, and this could be the biggest audience we've ever had at a Dean's Lecture, certainly for a long time. So we've had to get a bigger venue, and all because of our own MGSE rock star, they're who you're going to meet tonight. So as Lindsay said, everyone loves the theory, so you're all here for that. Can I start by acknowledging, I'll give you a few theories before we let Lindsay on. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet tonight, the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge their ancestors past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any Indigenous people that might be with us tonight. Can I also say that tonight's Dean's Lecture is part of the celebration for the 10-year anniversary of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and I'd like to particularly welcome all alumni that might be here tonight. And can I just say what a spectacular history it has been. As a graduate school, it's exceeded its market share and certainly created an amazing impact across Australia in that decade. And so to everyone that's been part of that decade, I congratulate you all and acknowledge Field as the Dean that set up the graduate school. So thank you to everyone that would be here tonight. As I said, we've got about 400 people here tonight, which is fantastic, and a testament to Lindsay and the work that the Positive Psychology Research Centre have been doing. That is world-renowned and certainly leading behaviour and practice in Australia. So it's fantastic to be here. I did ask Lindsay, and this is true, does he get nervous before speaking such of large groups? And he said, no, he didn't get nervous, but he does feel aroused. So, and when you stand up, you'll confirm that that's an accurate statement. Oh, no, not that one, sorry. I just wanted to let you know that I wasn't making it up, but we don't need an evidence-based presentation. Okay, let me be formal now. Tonight we welcome Professor Lindsay Oades to present his inaugural Dean's Lecture at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. If you go to Lindsay's website, the first line is in the About section says he approaches life as an adventure. His mission statement, if you will, is that well-being is everybody's business, and that's certainly true. His goal for every Australian school student is to have a personalised well-being plan. I want to tell you a little bit about my research. I wondered when I first got here, this is the only research question I've asked myself in the 10 months, are positive psychologists positive people? And so it's been a study of one, Lindsay, and I really questioned that because being an Adelaide Crows supporter made me wonder whether anyone could be positive about that. But as the season progressed, he was always hopeful every week and certainly proved to me that Thriveability is about looking forward to the future proactively. So most of you would know that Lindsay is the Director of Positive Psychology at the Graduate School, and before joining the Centre, Lindsay was the Founding Director of the Australian Institute for Business Wellbeing at the University of Wollongong for 15 years. Lindsay's PhD was in clinical psychology. In 2013, Lindsay achieved an Australian Government citation for an outstanding contribution to student learning. He has supervised 15 doctoral students successfully to completion and has taught applied psychology in Australia, Hong Kong and Japan at undergraduate and postgraduate levels for 20 years. He has over 100 scholarly publications and numerous awards in the applications of wellbeing science. Lindsay is no stranger to the stage as he speaks at conferences all around the world. He is currently negotiating his 5th book contract, which will be based on the theory of wellbeing, Thriveability Theory. And can I just add, in my previous life, I've certainly been at the applied side in schools, and there is no bigger issue in schools right now in relation to mental health issues, both for teaching staff and for students, anxiety, cyberbullying, learning difficulties. And Lindsay's work and the work of his amazing team is right at the cutting edge of trying to get to the basis of unlocking some of the challenges that young people face as they seek to make their way in a really turbulent world that is changing more rapidly than ever before. So this is amazing work, and we're really privileged to have Lindsay here tonight to present his topic on How do we learn to thrive? The emergence of wellbeing science. Ladies and gentlemen, can I welcome Lindsay Oades.
Welcome everybody. Can you hear me up the back okay? You go right up the back. This is lovely to see. Sincerely, thank you all for coming tonight. You could have been doing other things, but you've joined us here tonight for this important topic. I remember presenting here exactly 2 years ago while the President of the United States of America was literally being elected. For some of you, that wasn't a good night. But I have a better feeling about tonight. Who's up for a good night? Who's ready? Okay, let's go. I want to start by a journey to a place far away from here in Pietermaritzburg in South Africa. This is a time when I was 5 years old, apartheid South Africa. I was on there, my father is an academic and he was on sabbatical to Pietermaritzburg. So I come from academic pedigree. I prefer to think of myself as an academic mongrel, really because that's where your innovation comes from. But I've got off the story already, which I will tend to do. South Africa, I was there, and I'll let you choose in the photo which one's me. This is my friend Joseph. Joseph and I used to play go-karts, and I used to hold on tight, as you can see me there, hold on tight, and we'd whiz right down to the bottom and stop just before the traffic was coming across the road. And then one night when I was walking back up to the top where my mum was, I could hear my dear mum, not with me anymore, but I could hear my dear mum very assertive with somebody. My son will play with whoever he wants to play with. You can't tell me not to play with a black boy. Bang! Right then, right there. A real formative moment for me personally, getting emotional now, in social justice, because my mum was saying, this black boy is valuable, you're valuable, and he will play with whoever he wants. Since that time, I've got to know fancy words like moral inequality, structural violence, all of these things I learnt later on. But this was a really important moment for me because as a 5-year-old, I knew that wasn't right. And I knew, morally, that he was equal to me. And I knew that at 5. So when we come to Thriveability Theory, I use these sorts of examples to really think through, fundamentally, if we're developing theories of well-being, are we going back to first principles of moral equality? Does one person equal one other person? And if they don't meet those criteria, you'll probably find that you're not going to get well-being structured throughout a society. So I thank Joseph for that, and I remind Joseph, and I think of Joseph every time that we've been working through building Thriveability Theory. So we'll move from Africa over across, and we'll talk about elephants. Why not talk about elephants? I live near the zoo. Some mornings I can hear the baboons. We're going to talk about elephants. Many of you would have heard, who's heard of the story of the blind man and the elephant? Yep, so many of you would have heard this story. It's quite a well-known story, dates back to Buddhist India, and some people think even beyond that. So, as you can see here, there's a set of blind men trying to work out what's the elephant. And have a look. I think we've got some sociologists. Any sociologists in the room? Or any people trained in sociology? We've got one, okay. I reckon there's more. So sociologists feeling up the elephant, going, trying to understand well-being. Maybe there's something to do with structure in there. And then maybe there's a feminist theorist up the back going, it's patriarchy. Definitely patriarchy is going to explain all of well-being. And then there's a positive psychologist, maybe bumping around near the foot, going, there's 5. Maybe it's positive emotions and engagement and relationships, meaning and accomplishment, the toenails. And we've got it. We've got the whole of wellbeing because we've got PERMA. I would refer to that as a form of psychological reductionism. If you're taking one part, one theory, one discipline to try and explain the whole of population well-being, you've got a problem. In the same way, if you're going, oh, we've got it explained by dopamine, or we've got it explained by serotonin, you've got biological psychiatry, you've got a form of reductionism where you're trying to reduce everything to a few concepts and explain the whole of population well-being like that. And your training, your conceptual background, you'll want to see it in there. You'll want that to be the one. And these are the challenges that we have when we're truly looking to develop, if we're looking to develop a multidisciplinary, comprehensive, mid-level theory of well-being, we have to get out of our own discipline and we have to see beyond it in the same way that the fable of the elephant tells us. So beware of psychological reductionism, biological reductionism, trying to explain all aspects of well-being from your particular perspective. But that's easier said than done. So I want to talk you through some of the early influences over what I'm calling Thriveability Theory. And Jim, because it's the 10th anniversary of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, I'm going to start with education at 9 o'clock there. Thriveability Theory fundamentally is a theory about learning. And I don't have to spend too long justifying the link between education and well-being. We know that educated people do better, they do better soon, they do better later, they do better over time. That, I'm not going to cover the evidence for it because there's so much of it and it's almost a given. I'm going to move to philosophy. What has philosophy got to tell us about thrivability? What has philosophy got to tell us about well-being? Most of you who are positive psychology people, and look at all the people from my team here, this is really nice. You will know the distinction from philosophy, hedonism, the idea of more pleasure than pain. That's one particular way of understanding happiness. Aristotle's notion of eudaimonism, true self, another way, values, virtue, growing, developing, another way of understanding well-being. Philosophers have given us that distinction. It's very useful in some ways, but in another set of ways we need to move beyond it, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I'll go over here for a moment, hello over here. System science. So many of you have heard of system science. The elephant is one analogy of system science. The cause of the causes, going upstream, these sorts of metaphors, dealing with complexity, part-whole relationships. These are all concepts now coming increasingly known from system science, and the elephant I spoke about is one example of that. And this is really relevant to today's society. We continually, collectively seem to develop results that we don't want. We have good intentions individually, yet somehow as a collective we seem to be generating major world problems and we seem to be repeating them. And that's usually indicative of some form of systems failure, systems problem that hasn't been worked through. Going towards any medical practitioners, people trained in medicine here? We got one, two, I bet you there's more as well. Epidemiology is one of the big influences of thrivability theory, and particularly the social determinants of health. One of the big insights, and I'll say a little more about this in a moment, one of the big insights from this particular discipline and area of study is the idea of agency being a dependent variable. Let me unpack what that means. Agency, the idea that we can choose, that we have choices, that we can act on the world, we are an agent. Many psychologists often assume that people have got it and then they've developed things and then they'll say, well, you can do it, punch the air and everyone believe and you can achieve. These are sort of ideas from agency. It assumes it. But what we know is many people don't actually feel like that. Many people don't have that sense that they can act on the world. This social determinants idea is that get the social conditions right, be it the social structure, the economics, the education, etc., and then people will develop a sense of agency. And that's one of the big critiques of psychology in general, is that it assumes agency too much. And those of you who are practitioners, who work with disadvantaged, traumatised people, people with schizophrenia who struggle to get motivated, you'll know what I'm talking about in terms of don't assume agency. How do people get it? That's actually the bigger challenge and the bigger test that we need to put to our grand theories of well-being. Okay, we'll go to economics. A lot of tender-minded people don't want to talk about money or economics, but we know that it matters, and it matters a lot. One of the big things that economics brings us is Amartya Sen's capability theory and capability approach. If you're an economist or a human development person, you'll go, well, hey, that was the 1980s. I'll go, yeah, it's still good. And one of the things we're trying to do here is marry capability to wellbeing science, to system science, and then Thriveability Theory is born. And one of the reasons I want to do that is because we need to influence public policy. And we can do psychology all we like, but if we don't influence economic and public policy, we will not make grand changes to population-based wellbeing. And that is why I'm going in this particular direction. Okay, so now for the one sociology person, this is for you. The structure agency debate is again, think of the women's movement, think of the feminist movement. It's a really good example, a contemporary example of the structure agency debate. A pure agency position would say it's individual's choice, you can do it. A social structural position will say there are many constraints against you, you can't lift yourself up without the system changing. Agency approaches are very convenient for governments who don't want to change things because you can shift the responsibility to the individual. If you're going to change social structures, that's going to take a lot more work. Some sociologists actually critique positive psychology and they'll say cognition's the problem because if you're talking about cognition, you're not changing the social structure. You're teaching people to accept it how it is. Whether you agree with that or not, I don't know. But these are the types of debates that you'll see. I'm going to come and my dear colleagues make fun of me for this, and good on you, I need it. Political philosophy. What is a positive psychologist doing reading political philosophy? The reason I read political philosophy is if we're truly serious about well-being and understanding it at a population level, we need to understand how the power structures and how systems operate. At a recent conference in Europe, I presented on the idea of a Trojan horse liberalism in our wellbeing theories. And what I mean by that is individual freedom seems to be held up as this thing which is the be-all and end-all. And if we have individual freedom, we have well-being. And that's what I call Trojan horse liberalism. I'm heavily influenced by an area called communitarianism. And I said every time I use an ism or an ology, people gradually go to sleep. But hey, the room is full and we're talking about theory, so I'm okay. What is communitarianism? It's this idea that you, each of you, all of us come from a community and our identity is inseparable from that community. It's also the idea that rather than getting too hung up about individuals' rights, we actually need to think about communities' rights. Rather than these left-right arguments between, oh, it's the state trying to control you, or it's the market should be free and the market's controlling you, let's think about the community and the rights of communities and the fact of how we are embedded in communities. And there were two influences that led me to reading about communitarianism as a political philosophy. One was the fact that we need to think in terms of more systems, rather than just thinking, as I said, in terms of individuals. And the second factor is one of the most robust, consistent, reliable predictors of well-being is the quality of our social relationships. So why not choose a political philosophy that is entirely consistent with the evidence that we have about predictors of well-being? So this represents a menu of things that we've used to influence and develop the theory, and this will continue. It's no small effort to try and track across multiple disciplines to understand well-being. But if we're going to have a theory of well-being, why not have one from Australia rather than continually importing everybody else's? Sorry, I had a nationalist moment there, but we'll be okay. All right, everyone's talking about tips. You know, I've got the 5 secrets to happiness. I've got a happiness hack. Everyone is doing that. I would say, sorry, you're part of the problem. We need to get beyond that, and I'll explain why as we work through this theory. David Gordon, have a look at some of his tips on how to be healthy. Don't be poor. Don't live in a deprived area. Don't be disabled. Don't be a lone parent. Okay, David Gordon, he is actually a serious poverty researcher. So his tips are actually satire. He's actually pointing out of the agency problem. That is, holding the individual responsible for health and well-being. Don't be poor is a perfect example. And this is part of what we're getting at in terms of the agency problem and relying on the individual, which in many ways the individual is the lowest level of the system. It's the lowest level. Yes, we can go micro below the individual, but it's a very low level. So why are we relying on the individual to champion things much more important like population well-being? So I commend Michael Marmot's book to you for a read in terms of really thinking through social determinants of health, but also think about what does that mean for well-being, that sort of subjective sense of health. Think about that, and I implore you to think more broadly than those hacks, tips, all the things that marketing wants, because what we really need is you to have agency to develop your own tips for your own context. Then we're away. Then you're the author of your own tips. Rather than fast food, kit home style psychology where you're importing everyone else's tips. That is part of what Thriveability Theory is about. I had the pleasure earlier this year to attend the World Government Summit at the launch of the World Happiness Report. I had the pleasure again of meeting Lord Richard Layard, who's a Labour economist out of the London School of Economics. One of the things he put, and this is me paraphrasing what he said that day, but it's a very nice way of summarising it. In wealthy nations, it's mental illness that causes the greatest level of distress. So I'll say that again. It's very simple, but there's a lot of evidence for this. In wealthy nations, it's mental illness that causes the greatest level of distress, and in the developing nations, it's poverty. And we really start to get thinking seriously about these broader issues when Richard lays them out like that. So as Jim mentioned, I often say well-being is everyone's business. I talked about communitarianism before. Well-being is everyone's business, meaning well-being is everyone's responsibility. It's okay to talk about rights, but we also have to talk about responsibility, and we also have to talk about social responsibility. So yes, well-being is your responsibility, but it's also the person next to you. You're responsible for their well-being too. That doesn't run well at the moment with some of the political discourse that we have. But the increasing evidence we have about inequality is also telling us that doesn't run well with well-being. So we're testing out the limits of libertarianism in the US, and we're seeing what's happening. It is not gelling well with the evidence around well-being. Stiglitz's work on inequality, etc. So if you look closely, and Lara, thank you for making the slides, but I changed this one. Does anyone know who this man is? Bill Gates. Yes, and he has in front of him a jar of human poo. And so why does he do that? Okay, he could be considered a businessman, could he not? Yeah, he's done pretty well in business, you would say. Wellbeing is his business, or at least health is his business. His foundation is to develop better toilets for the sake of hygiene, because he's looked at the evidence and it's the poor design of toilets which is leading to disease. And so that's where he's putting a lot of his time and a lot of his money. And the other reason is, the thing about his human poo is we notice negativity bias in action. It's disgusting. We notice it because we know it contains bacteria. But if Bill Gates can spend his time doing that, demonstrate that commitment, it's his business, he's investing in it. I would implore everyone else to think about their social responsibility in terms of wellbeing and invest in it. Okay, I've talked for long enough, and now I want to hand to you have a think about 5 things. If you're going to have the biggest chance of experiencing well-being, in however way you define that, what 5 things, broadly defined, I mean big, do you think people need to be free from? If you could eliminate 5 things that it's going to make it more likely for you to experience well-being, what 5 would you choose? Have a go. I'll give you literally 38 seconds. That was really good. You guys are really good. Undergraduate classes are not that quick. Thank you for being so quick. I'll leave you with that question, and I'm not going to go our end and ask you all what you had. But it's a useful exercise to think through. So what I want to do now is step you through the key building blocks of this. I said the abstract said I was going to invite you in to us co-constructing Thriveability Theory. So I want to take you through the building blocks. These are tentative. Okay? The theory is not complete. It's going to take a while, but I'm helping build it with you. But what I'm asking you to do is, these are 5 tentative things that we need to be free from. And of course, this will be influenced by evidence, literature, argument, etc. Poverty and inequality, and people always say inequality of what, which is a key debate in the politics of well-being. Disease and disability, alienation and isolation, which relates to the moral inequality. I was referring back to Joseph. Violence, that's a big one that people often will, and I wonder who had violence. Yep, comes up a lot. Corruption, and there may be others, but really thinking about these things that we need to be free from. It's not a particularly positive psychology thing to be doing, but positive psychology doesn't explain the whole of well-being. It contributes a whole lot, but there are other areas that we need to draw from. So you've had a go at helping build some of the constraints or the things we need to be free from in the development of Thriveability Theory. I have the pleasure of talking to lots of people in lots of different contexts, nurses, doctors, teachers, children, people in aged care, wherever, corporate, and asking them their definitions and language they use around well-being. We're not going to do that tonight, but I'm going to tell you where I've settled. Lindsay settles, wow. I'm going to tell you where I've got to, and that is I view well-being as an experience. And one of the things I'm trying to do here is putting the being back into well-being. Not making it a cognition, not making it something on a scale, but an actual lived experience. Good old-fashioned existential being back into well-being. And what I mean by that is we have experiences every day. Some good, some not, and we tell stories about them. I would argue, and do argue in Thriveability Theory, that we can usefully classify these into 3 types. Experiences of connection, and that deliberately broadly defined. Connection might be with self, connection may be with place, connection may be with another, connection may be with the community, but that sense of connection. There are many other terms that get used, but I'm using that one for the moment. The second one is the experience of capability itself. I feel capable. I can be and do things. Has anyone here felt capable in the last 24 hours? That's more than we have sociologists. This is good. And finally, this experience of contentment. I didn't say positive emotions, and I'll come to what I mean by that and why not later. Contentment, the old existential, often championed in Eastern traditions, this sense of content. I'm okay, I'm satisfied, I'm good, I'm low arousal, I'm good. That one. Those 3 types of experiences are the way Thriveability Theory is conceptualising how we live and experience well-being, which is similar to some of our approaches and different in other ways, and we'll come to that. So I want you again to have a go, have a chance to talk. So talk to the person next to you. If you don't like the person on your left, talk to the person on your right. But what I want you to do is just tell a brief story. Doesn't have to be a fancy story, doesn't have to be a grand story, it can be really plain and simple, but a little story involves a period across time where a few things happened and things happen and interact. That's all. Either you experience some connection, you experienced a sense of capability where you could be and do, or you were really content. Have a go. I knew that was always going to be the hardest task of the evening, to stop you. And I don't mean that in a nasty way. The very reason that narratives and stories are in Thriveability Theory is because the cultural anthropologists and others will tell us it's part of being human. We tell and retell stories about our experiences. What more natural way should we be building a wellbeing theory? We need to build it around narratives and the experience of narrative, because that's what we do. We don't necessarily tick Likert scales. We tell stories. So that's one of the reasons it's in there. Yes, it might be hard to turn into quantitative methods, etc., but that's what we do. And that's how we live, and that's how we interpret our experience. And so that's why it's in. Okay, I want to talk about capability. We're in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education lecture. Many people hear capability and they think about curriculum and things to do with capability that they've learned from an education framework. That's relevant, it's important, but a lot of what I'm talking about here is the capability idea from Amartya Sen's work in the capabilities approach. You can go away and read that if you haven't heard of it. A simple shorthand is what I can be and do. That's as simple as that. What can I be and do? And the economic breakthrough there was, rather than focusing on utility and happiness and things like that, it was, do we have a population of people who are free to choose what they want to be and what they want to do? And that's an index of development from Amartya Sen's approach. So I'm using that and marrying it to wellbeing science and system science to build this particular theory. So I want to come straight back to the story you were just working with. Stay with the same partner because it seemed like you got along okay. And the question I'm putting to you, working with the story, it might have not been your story, but working with the story that was told, what 4 capabilities were necessary for you to make it likely that you had that experience? What 4 qualities do you have in yourself? Yeah, there were lots of other things that might have led to it, but 4 personal capabilities that you had or demonstrated that are likely to have led to the enablement and the emergence of that particular experience. Have a go. Okay, and there are of course people who will watch this video later, here or overseas, so turn to the cameras and give them a good wave, please. There they are. Okay, I want to gradually building you through the key elements to build this theory. So what we've done, just to summarise a little, we've looked at the things down the bottom that we need to be free from, or the constraints. I asked you about telling stories of experiences, and I said they came in 3 types: stories around connection, stories around capability, stories around contentment, or it's useful to think of them in that way, to classify them. And then I brought you down a level and I said, what are the capabilities that might have led to the emergence of that experience? So I've actually tracked you through 3 exercises which correspond with the 3 different levels of the theory that we're building. Going to build you up a little bit more. You love theory, that's why you came tonight. So a couple of other parts. Thriveability theory fundamentally views the self as a narrative. So that squiggly thing that goes up, it breaks past a couple of the constraints, uses capabilities to allow the experience to emerge. It's the idea of self developing over time in narrative. We tell and retell stories about ourselves, and eventually, hopefully, agency emerges and we have an identity and a narrative in that idea, and it's differentiated. And that's our life's work. Okay? It's in motion. Try and stop it. You'll go home tonight and say, I went to this talk and he talked about theory all night. That was part of your narrative. So this is what happens. So that's in there too. And you'll notice a couple of other key things in this complex building of this complex theory. Freedom from and freedom to. Again, that's from political philosophy. Isaac Berlin's work, that we need to have freedoms, different types of freedoms. We've got to be freedom from constraint, but we've got to have freedom to choose as well. And also, finally, up the top left, the idea of emergent lived experience. It's your experience. I asked you to tell your story. But what I argue is that emerges from the interaction of a whole lot of other things. Let me unpack that. Jim mentioned that we had an emergency today in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. There was fire alarms. And I had the pleasure of walking over to Kathy and saying, Kathy, emergency comes from the Latin word arising from. And it does. That's what it means, arising from. Okay? It doesn't mean ambulance. It means arising from. It emerges. So we have emergent canopies, we have trees, we have rainforests. They have emergent canopies. What Thriveability Theory does is it says well-being is an emergent experience. And this is actually really important to the whole theory. Because if it's emergent, we can't get there straight away. We can't just go there in a straight line. So all those people that are giving you hacks and tips in a linear way, part of the problem. And I'm rejecting that view outright. It is the interaction of the situation, or some people would call it context. It's the interaction of that, your capabilities, the things that you're trying to be free from, the constraints, and in a public policy and economic perspective, inputs as well. That little arrow up there that says input, we can put public housing in there, we can put education, we can put health spending, we can put most of the federal budget in that little arrow. This poor little thing got squashed, but that's the idea. So emergence is the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. If you think of your family is a group of people, but it's actually the interactions between the family that make it a family. This idea is that well-being emerges from the interaction between the constraints, the inputs, the situation, and the capabilities. And which ones can we change? We can change the inputs and we can change the capabilities. Enter the importance of education. Education is the capability component, inputs are the public policy component. So we have married systems theory to capability theory to wellbeing science. And that's part of what we're doing here. And because of our great producers of the slides, it looks like a tree. So look at that. It goes like a tree. Oh. So one other thing you will have noticed, there's a little red and green Smarties on the diagram. And this is the really important theoretical part of what Thriveability Theory does. In the debate, the philosophical debates, we have the eudaimonic, the meaning and purpose view of well-being, and we have the hedonic view, pleasure, maximising pleasure over pain. And the philosophers argue it's this one, no, it's this one, no, which is what philosophers tend to do. What Thriveability Theory does is it says the hedonic, the pleasure and pain, the positive emotions, etc., are feedback within the system towards eudaimonic well-being. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's okay. If you do know what I'm talking about, that's okay too. But what I want you to understand here is there's been a big debate in what is well-being. People say it's either or. By putting it in a systems theory, we're saying it's both, but they have a different purpose. So let me introduce you to what I call the survival dashboard. Positive and negative emotions. We hear a lot about this in positive psychology. Positive emotions, joy, generally people might say happiness, just feeling joyful. Negative emotions, fear, anxiety, not arousal, Jim. But so people are familiar with that. Pleasure, people are hopefully familiar with that. Pain, okay. These two combined, this positive emotions, and particularly pleasure and pain, often gets referred to the hedonic approach to well-being. Or in the general public, many people will call it happiness. There is another area called approach motivation, when you move towards something you want, be it saving for a holiday, or avoidance or escape motivation, where you run away from a lion, or something you don't want. What I would say is these are actually, from Thriveability Theory approach, these are feedback. These are messages. These are ways of knowing on our longer term journey. Yes, they could be construed happiness, but they're actually just messengers. So emotions is a way of knowing. Sensory pleasure and pain is a way of knowing. And that actually cognitive sense of motivation is a way of knowing about something broader. They're momentary. They come and go. I would say they're messengers, and many emotionologists would probably agree with me. But it doesn't get talked about that way enough. So if you think of positive emotion as a green light, some of what we're seeing lately in our discussions about happiness and well-being is you're falling in love with the green light. You're falling in love with a message. If you stand too long looking at a green light, you'll probably get hit by a car. It's a different way of thinking about it. So actually think about it as a feedback in a system which is guiding you, go forward, go back, slow down, speed up, on a longer term journey to a systems-based approach to well-being. So it's not that hedonism is bad, it's just a messenger. Don't fall in love with the message. Don't shoot the messenger. Don't fall in love with the green light. That's one of the key messages of Thriveability Theory. And this brings us to the kind of what I would say the punchline of Thriveability Theory. And here we may as well go the whole way, so we'll take down the American Constitution while we're at it. Don't pursue happiness. Pursuit means to chase. Happiness in Thriveability Theory is the pleasure, is the green light. It's like you chasing after a green light. It's a good message, but don't pursue it. Prepare for well-being, i.e. build capabilities, and then let it emerge. Prepare and let go. Prepare and let go. That is the key message of Thriveability Theory. So, and it sits with that idea if you try to do something too directly. I'm going out tonight to be happy. I'm going out tonight to be happy. Tell everyone, we're going to be happy tonight. That's the idea where cognition actually gets in the way of letting the experience happen. But if you have the capability and you're prepared, it will unfold. And if the inputs are right and the context is right, it will emerge. So that's where Thriveability Theory positions both hedonism, positions the eudaimonic approach, and it marries it to a systems theory to reconceptualise a lot of these different components and parts. And that's why you end up with really complex diagrams like this. But just to summarise, and then we'll move on to the so what, Lindsay. I've spent 50 minutes listening to theory. Constraints. Once we are clear on those constraints, and we are getting pretty clear with what we understand about human development and what kills well-being. We've got a sense of how well-being emerges, but we also have to then build and work out what the capabilities are. And you'll notice lots of question marks in there with those capabilities because they're not decided upon yet. Which capabilities do we think will lead to a sense of connection? Are they generative relationships? Is it perspective taking? Is it sense of building mutuality? Is it the idea of appreciating nature and connecting with nature and place? What is the evidence base? So to get in there, in the completed Thriveability Theory, you have to actually, we're running systematic reviews, looking at meta-analyses. Then we're not just going to put them in there because we like them or we like the sound of the word, which seems to be some way people choose their pet theories. there's going to be proper systematic reviews and meta-analyses to work out what goes in. In terms of what goes into capability, we already know that literacy is a big driver of people's opportunities, etc. And those of you who are educators will agree with me. I'll talk about wellbeing literacy in a moment as one example of a capability, but there are other things. Mental and physical fitness is a pretty good driver of capability, as is this good old-fashioned thing called reasoning or practical reasoning. That makes us more capable, it's learnable. So all of these things are capabilities. They have to be tractable, they have to be learnable, teachable and learnable, and then we build them. And you can start to see where education becomes not an afterthought, not an add-on, but centrepiece to population-based wellbeing. Finally, contentment. What might get in there? Could it be value congruence, living in line with our own values? Might it be self-acceptance? Might it be self-regulation? Which one of these deserves to get in there as part of the things that interact to enable wellbeing to emerge? And all of you will have a view. You'll be going, this should be in there, this should be in there, this should be in there. And believe me, people get very passionate about this and they don't want to be left out. Creativity needs to be in there, Lindsay. No, it's got to be spirituality. And people do, they get very passionate about what should be in such an approach. I want to give you an example and a flavour of one area, which is wellbeing literacy. At the Centre for Positive Psychology, we have 3 research streams. We have this one, we're talking about wellbeing literacy research stream. We also have a wellbeing measurement or methods stream, and we have a wellbeing systems stream or systems-informed positive psychology. Wellbeing literacy is a capability. It's communicating about and for wellbeing. So I want you to have a look at those questions and rate yourself, say out of 10, I'm really good at it, or 0, I'm not so good at it. Like I have many words I can think of to communicate wellbeing. I know a lot about wellbeing. And the one down the bottom really gets to it. I can communicate about wellbeing in multiple ways, writing, listening, drawing. I can adapt those multiple ways of communicating about wellbeing to suit my audience. Has everyone rated themselves? Of course, you all rated yourselves well. Now rate your spouse or maybe a loved one. Seriously, have a think about someone else. How would you rate them? This doesn't just belong in schools. This belongs in families. This belongs in organisations. This is actually a population health-based idea. How do we have a wellbeing literate population? And that starts to get us thinking more broadly. So who did better than their spouse? Okay, so I just want to summarise and then conclude with some important ideas. I've tracked you through a fairly complex theory with constraints, with capabilities, the idea that wellbeing is an experience which emerges from the interaction of those components. Best way to access it is through telling stories. I introduced you to the survivability dashboard and basically kicked hedonism over to being a messenger, a feedback in a system, but preserved it because that's useful. It's just not wellbeing. And I also said, prepare for wellbeing, don't pursue happiness. Now, Catherine helped talk to me about my story, and I brought this slide up too early, and I've failed all advice I've been given, but we'll be okay. What I want you to think about is how do we approach mental health and wellbeing in society at the moment? Have a real think about that. What are we doing? Okay, turn on the TV. 1 in 5 people have mental illness. Youth suicide rates are increasing. We're seeing this, we're seeing this. And then it goes, therefore we need more medical services. That's usually the discourse that we hear. I would liken our approach at the moment to what some of the local governments are doing. They're basically putting nets at the bottom of their storm drains to stop plastic bottles going into the ocean. And that's what they're doing. in and of itself, it's a good thing. The plastic bottle shouldn't get in the ocean. It's going to harm the marine life, etc., and have a long half-life, etc. So it's good. It's a good thing in its own right. But water is life-giving, and then we put this plastic bottle around it to share it around, etc., and then we ruin the place in doing it. Our approach to mental health and wellbeing is very similar. We kind of develop these things. We develop treatments and we develop medications and we treat people as individuals. And then we go, hey, it's not working. All the things are getting worse. And then we start doing more of the same and push more of the same. So how do we get rid of the plastic bottle in the sense of mental health and wellbeing approaches? That is the broader question. And I'm not just talking about a slightly different treatment. I'm talking about wholesale rethink of the way we're doing it. And this is where education is not an add-on, it is central. It's not a health system and an education system. It's all in, all together, one approach with capability and wellbeing as the primary outcome. So I want to end by taking us back from Pietermaritzburg in South Africa to a glorious city called marvellous Melbourne. Come forward a whole generation right to now. Young person. Having a look at a young person, a 12-year-old who has a striking similarity to me for some reason. But let's have a think about that. What do our approaches to wellbeing, the different theories, the different disciplines I've covered, what do they tell us about how a young person like this, or a 12-year-old or a young person who's very dear to your heart, what do they give us? What do they tell us? What do they enable us to think about? How could this young person grow, develop, be capable to be and to do in a system with inputs, in multiple contexts, in a very diverse, changing world? This is where it is real. This is where it matters. Okay, I like theory. That's my job. That's what I do. But unless it comes down to giving us better answers and better approaches to people like this person and people of this age in this and in less advantaged places, it doesn't do the job. So what I will leave you with is a big choice. We can go down the left-hand lane, what I would call the medicalization of distress approach. And note those words very carefully. I didn't say medicine. I didn't say all of the good work that medical practitioners are doing. I didn't say that. I said medicalization of distress. We can go down an approach where we focus on just removing the negative states. We focus on removing anxiety or depression and that's it. Or contemporary views of wellbeing, the presence of positive. And in my view, the presence of capabilities, the actual ability to be and to do. Not just to have the experience of wellbeing, but to be able to have it again and over again and over again. And not just as an individual, but as systems and organisations, urban design, multiple things that privilege and value wellbeing. We can view it just as a single event, or we can view it as a development process. This young person will develop over time, and they'll develop capabilities over time, or we can focus on the one time that they experienced anxiety and we'll just get stuck, and we can medicalise that. And one of the problems I see at the moment is more and more organisations, medical-based organisations, are getting funding and they're going into to talk with young people, and they're giving them very elaborate language about illness and distress. And we're feeding them that. And it's being positioned as a good thing and as a solution. I request that you explore the idea that some of our solutions are the problem. And some of our fixes are failing. And we need to rethink how we're doing it in a very big way. Not only from thinking beyond the individual, but actually going right to our community. How is our community thinking about this? How is our community taking responsibility? Rather than shipping people off to professional services and telling them that's the only way, and inadvertently disempowering them because we're telling them, you don't have it, you can't do it yourself, we've got to ship them out of here, and let the health service be responsible for population health and well-being. And I'm not making some friends here. There's some very powerful people, very powerful organisations that won't like what I just said. If you're a conservative politician, you'll want strong, simple medical solutions. If you're a pharmaceutical company, you'll want the same. You don't want distributed, community-based, education-based approaches because you have an investment in the status quo. So thinking beyond reductionism, thinking to a whole of system approach, thinking beyond things being fixed to changeable, tractable, we can learn it. Thinking beyond the idea that we have direct access to reality. If you've got direct access to reality, I'll come with you tonight, let's go. Because I would argue, and many good philosophers would argue, that our experience is mediated by language. The language we use, the stories we tell to construct illness and well-being perpetuate. I can talk about your experience as a disorder. I can talk about your experience as a life challenge. There are many ways we can construct it and reconstruct it in narrative. So I implore you to think about the power of language, and that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about the idea of wellbeing literacy, because it is a huge lever in the way we actually conceptualise health and well-being. And finally, the idea of treat. Are we going to treat and prevent our way to population well-being, or are we going to build capability to population well-being? That's the choice we have. We can continue to medicalise well-being, distress, or we can take a learning approach, and we can make learning central to population-based wellbeing. And I don't just mean school-based learning. The very reason I changed my career from a clinical psychologist, gradually worked through workplace wellbeing, the very reason I moved and have kept taking an education-based approach is this is our biggest lever. This is our biggest chance to get this right. This is what we must do. So when we go back to thinking about the young person in distress, okay, they're not going to school because they're avoiding school, they're feeling nervous, something's not functioning well. What's your default conceptualisation? Literally, what's your automatic approach? Do you start thinking about medical distress? Do you start thinking something's wrong? We need to get help. We need to get this treated. This should be prevented. Or do we go, our young person hasn't learnt how to something yet? Or if we keep working on this, they will learn how to be able to regulate, or they will be able to over time focus on this, or we're putting them with others who are teaching them how to. So fundamentally the question I put to you is, when we see distress, do we immediately jump to a medical conceptualisation? Or do we think of it as a learning difficulty that could be overcome, something that we can learn and change and is tractable? And as educators in the broad community, we can do this differently. That's the question I put to you, and I invite you down the right-hand lane to a wellbeing learning approach. Positive education is one example of wellbeing learning. It's not the only example, it's particularly school-based, but doesn't have to be. Teaching and learning wellbeing language, not illness language. This is where we're inviting you to. So I want to end with some examples of what we're doing. And who's going to the World Congress next year on positive psychology? Okay, we're not leaving until everyone raises their hand. All right, so for the first time out of North America, we will have the 6th World Congress in Positive Psychology in Melbourne next year, July 18th to 21st. If you're interested in anything I've said tonight, I strongly encourage you to join us in some shape or form at that Congress. Another big thing that's happening at the moment is a collaboration between us, Centre for Positive Psychology, Melbourne Graduate School of Education, University of Melbourne, with the Department of Education and Training, Geelong Grammar School, and Maroondah City Council, with this idea of building positive education hubs, clusters of schools and learning hubs around positive education and teaching young people wellbeing related skills. And if we get this right, there is a chance that we can take this across all schools in Victoria. We're working hard on that. That's our goal. It's being talked about. It's real. It's in the minister's mouth. It's going on. We're chipping away. We're not there yet, but we're at least in the game. For those of you interested in public policy, in 2020 we'll be hosting the International Wellbeing and Public Policy Conference. And for those of you who are interested in local grassroots approaches, I have the pleasure of being a board member of Action for Happiness Australia. We have a thing called a Haptivist campaign, which is about social action. In the way I've talked about it tonight, probably social action for wellbeing, broad systems, community-based approaches, not just making yourself happy, but actually contributing and taking the social responsibility to do that. And finally, going forward, one of my goals, and Jim mentioned this, is for us to have a personalised wellbeing plan for every student, school-age student in Australia. What I mean by that is, imagine a world where, who's got kids, school-age kids? Okay, you're part of the solution now. Imagine teacher or school representative sitting with student and a parent or parents and having a collaborative conversation where they're actively planning towards the child's wellbeing and the child's view in the child's language, personalised to them a plan for wellbeing, broadly defined based on the evidence we know. And that collaborative conversation that requires intergenerational wellbeing literacy, so actually being able to talk across generations about wellbeing effectively, ends up in the school report. And it's monitored and it's part of system and routine practice. That will lead to a generational change in health and wellbeing. If you've got a whole generation having the agency and the ability and capability to sit down and do that. So we're trying to get funding for 6 pilot schools to do that, to prototype that, become web-based and gradually work towards that. Finally, imagine a Melbourne-based wellbeing learning centre where school children and their parents from around the country can tour through, have experiential exercises to learn best practice, most recent evidence that relates to their wellbeing and the wellbeing of others. So that's another thing that we're aiming to seek funding for, collaborating with corporates, etc., to build and realise that vision over time. And finally, I invite you to join me in lobbying federal and state governments for ministers for wellbeing. We have ministers for education, we have ministers, and social determinants of health would tell us that the Federal Treasurer will do more for wellbeing than the Health Minister because they distribute funding that has real impacts on people. But wellbeing cuts across it all. It cuts across health, it cuts across economics, employment, cuts across education. Other countries have ministers for happiness or wellbeing. Why can't we? So I invite you in joining into that and these endeavours. I thank you sincerely for your time tonight, and I wish you all very well. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, before you all disappear, can I just take 1 or 2 seconds to thank Lindsay for that great presentation tonight. It was a masterclass in showing us how theory gets developed from evidence and philosophy, and thinking about how we can make the opportunity available for everyone to thrive. And I think that's why we're here tonight. We all do want to be the best that we can be. Can I just tell you that I've been with Lindsay and watched him talk and listened to him talk to the Minister. He's got traction. The reason I changed jobs was to try to help a little bit to change theory into practice. And Lindsay and his team are doing that. They're translating the work. They're going into schools, they're going into workplaces, and they're changing the way people think about their employees, their students. And let me say, in terms of changes that will occur, and Lindsay sort of acknowledged a few at the end, all outcomes in schools, literacy, numeracy, will improve if everyone's got a wellbeing plan. We need to work hard together, and I think we've got great leadership in the Centre for Positive Psychology at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Can you thank Lindsay one more time, and could you accept this?